The north is cold and full of whispers.
Before we go any further, if you want the full 10-chapter breakdown, exclusive lore timelines and members-only deep dives into this story, the link is in the description. All of it lives on our Patreon. Now, let us go down into the dark. He had dreamed of this place again, not of the cold, which was ordinary. The cold was simply Winterfell. The cold was the only weather Jon Snow had ever trusted. This was something older. In the dream, he always walked these same stairs alone, the torch in his hand throwing the same long shadows across the same stone faces, and somewhere at the bottom, past the kings and the lords and the long rows of the Stark dead, something was moving, something he could never quite reach before he woke. He was not dreaming now. Ned Stark walked ahead of him without a torch. He knew these stairs the way a man knows his own heartbeat. Without needing to think about it, Jon followed, one hand trailing the wall, the rough-cut stone damp and cold under his palm, and tried to understand why his father had knocked on his door an hour before dawn and said only, "Come with me, bring your cloak." The crypt smelled of tallow, old stone, and something underneath both that Jon had no word for. Preservation, maybe. The smell of things kept from the air for a very long time. Ned stopped in front of the third statue from the end of the row. Jon stopped beside him and looked up at the carved face of a woman he had never met. She was young in the stone, younger than he was now. Almost with long hair the sculptor had rendered in careful parallel lines, and a face that Jon had grown up seeing in a different kind of stone. Every mirror in Winterfell. The same jaw, the same set of the eyes. He had always assumed it was coincidence. The Stark look was the Stark look. Half the North wore it. She was afraid, Ned said. His voice came out lower than a whisper, lower than the wind outside the castle walls. At the end, I had never seen her afraid of anything before that. Not when she rode, not when she argued with father, not when Brandon, he stopped himself, swallowed. She was afraid for the child. Jon's hand had gone still against the wall. "Father," he said. Ned did not look at him. He kept looking at the statue, at the young woman's stone face, at the roses the sculptor had placed in her hands, direwolves a Stark would have chosen. But she had asked for roses, blue winter roses. Jon had heard that, somewhere. From old Nan, maybe. The way you hear things you don't know you filed away until something shakes them loose. Her name was Lyanna, Ned said. You know that. She was your sister. Yes. A pause that lasted long enough for the torch flame to gutter and recover. She was also your mother. The crypt was very quiet. Jon did not move. He was not certain he could move. There was a sensation in his chest that he would later struggle to name. Not grief, because you could not grieve someone you had never known you'd lost. And not joy, because there was nothing in this room yet that felt like something to celebrate. It was closer to the feeling of a step that finds no ground, the moment of falling before the falling registers. My mother, Jon said. Yes. Then who? He stopped, because he already knew. He had always, somewhere beneath the surface of himself, refused to know. Who was my father? Ned finally turned. He looked at Jon the way Jon had seen him look at men who were about to be executed. Not without feeling, but with feeling, held completely still. Rhaegar Targaryen, Ned said. Crown Prince of the Seven Kingdoms, son of Aerys II, your father was the Dragon Prince. Jon's back found the wall behind him. He was not aware of having stepped backward. The stone was cold through his cloak, cold through the wool tunic under it, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Rhaegar Targaryen, the man Robert Baratheon had killed at the Trident, the man whose death had started the war that had swallowed the world, the man whose name Jon had heard spoken in exactly 2 registers his entire life, as tragedy or as crime, and never as anything approaching ordinary. He stole her, Jon said. The words came from somewhere automatic, somewhere that had not yet caught up with the last 30 seconds. He took her against... No, Ned's voice was flat in a way Jon had never heard from him. She went willingly. I know what the songs say. I know what Robert believes. Lyanna went willingly, Jon. She loved him. He let that sit. They were married, secretly, in Dorne, with a Septon as witness. What happened afterward? The war, Robert's rebellion, everything your generation inherited, none of it changes what they were to each other. And none of it changes what you are. Jon's mouth had gone dry. What I am, he repeated. You are Aegon Targaryen. Ned said the name quietly, but in the acoustics of the stone crypt, it arrived everywhere at once. Legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. By the laws of every kingdom that still bothers with laws, you are the rightful heir to the Iron Throne." The silence that followed was absolute. Jon looked up at the statue of the woman who had died giving birth to him. She had Stark eyes. She had his jaw. She had died in a tower in Dorne, with blood on the sheets and a secret in her arms, and the last thing she had done with her breath was make Eddard Stark promise to keep that secret until it was safe. It had not yet been safe for 15 years. "How did she die?" Jon said. It came out very flat. He did not mean it as a question about the manner. He understood childbirth, understood what a bed of blood meant, but as something else, as the only sentence he could manage that wasn't, "I have been wrong about everything. She made me promise her first." Ned's jaw was tight. "That was Lyanna. Even dying, she wanted the oath before she gave me what she was asking me to protect." He exhaled through his nose, slowly. "She said, 'Promise me, Ned,' just those 3 words, and then she gave you to me. And you were so small, Jon. You were so quiet. Most babes scream when they enter the world. You just looked, like you were already working something out." Jon's eyes were burning. He pressed the back of his wrist against them. He was not going to weep in the crypts of Winterfell over a woman he had never met. He was not. He pressed harder. "Robert," he said. His voice had steadied slightly. "Robert doesn't know. Robert would have killed you." Ned said it without cruelty, but without softening either. "You know the man he is. You've watched him for 3 days. Whatever he was at the Trident, whatever grief is underneath the drinking and the hunting, he hated Rhaegar Targaryen with everything in him, a Targaryen child hidden in Ned Stark's hall, raised as a Stark bastard." He shook his head once. "He would have seen it as betrayal. He would not have distinguished between you and your father." "Would he have been wrong too?" The words came out before Jon could stop them. He stared at the floor. "He killed my father. He sits a throne built on my family's graves. Should I be grateful he didn't know to kill me too?" Ned did not answer immediately. He stepped forward and put his hand on the back of Jon's neck, the same grip he had used when Jon was small and frightened and needed to feel that something solid existed in the world. "Your father was not the monster the songs made him," Ned said quietly. "I fought at the Trident. I believed what I believed. But I have had 15 years to sit with what I found in that tower, and I do not know any more that I was entirely right about what we were fighting for." He squeezed once. "What I know is that the man who died there was not a villain. He was a man who loved your mother and made choices that destroyed the world, and you are what those choices produced. And you are good, Jon. You are the best thing I have had a hand in. That is not nothing." Jon stood very still under his father's hand. The man he had called father his entire life. The man who was his uncle. The man who had loved him enough to spend 15 years letting the world believe the worst of him, rather than let the secret slip. He thought about the king upstairs. Robert Baratheon, fat and loud and drowning in old grief, who had ridden to Winterfell to take Ned south. He thought about King's Landing, a city he had never seen, and the red keep above it, and the iron throne inside the keep, made from 1,000 swords of a dynasty that was supposed to be over. He thought about the Kingsguard, 3 of the finest knights who had ever lived, standing at a tower in Dorne after the war was already lost, protecting a woman and a child instead of their king. Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. He had died on those steps for Jon, had chosen to die there, which was different from dying accidentally. Jon pulled in a slow breath through his nose. The crypt smelled of tallow and old stone, and the kept dead. "Why now?" he said. "Why tonight?" He looked older than he had looked this morning. "Because we ride south in 3 days. Because whatever the Red Keep is, it is not a place for secrets that have not been decided yet. I needed you to know before we walked into that city, Jon. I needed you to know who you are before they start telling you who you aren't." He looked at Lyanna's statue one final time. "And because she asked me to tell you, not forever, just when it was time." Jon looked at the stone face of the woman who had died for him. He thought, "I have her jaw." He thought, "My father's rubies are in the river we will cross on the way south." He thought, "No one in the world knows I am standing here." He did not say any of these things. "I need you to keep this," Ned said. "The secret. A while longer." How long is a while longer? Ned Stark looked at his son, his nephew, the boy he had raised, the king the world didn't know it had, standing in the cold beneath the statue of a dead woman who had loved a dead prince, in a crypt that smelled like everything being kept from the air. "Until I can find a way to tell it that doesn't start a war," Ned said. Jon nodded slowly. It was the only answer available. He had known, even before the nod, that he was going to give it. He looked up at Lyanna's face one last time. Then he turned and walked back up into the dark. The column moved like a slow wound through the landscape. Jon had never seen anything like it from the outside. He had imagined a royal progress as something orderly. Banners, horses, a clean procession with everyone in their appointed place. What it actually looked like, from his position near the rear of Ned's household contingent, was controlled chaos that had been performing discipline for so long that most of the people inside it had forgotten it was a performance. Wagons axle-deep in the ruts the advance riders had churned into mud. Grooms shouting, someone's hawk screaming from its perch on a gloved fist 3 rows ahead. The creak and groan of 1,000 leather straps all moving in the same direction at once. 200 men of the Stark household. 300 gold cloaks, Robert's escort, their armor buffed to a shine that was already losing the argument with the road. A dozen knights in Lannister crimson riding in the Queen's column, 40 paces to Jon's left. Wagons carrying food, wine, portable furniture, caged ravens, chests of correspondence, weapons, wardrobe, the detritus of a court that had to carry its own civilization with it because it could not trust any other. Jon was listed on Ned's manifest as personal secretary, household of the hand. It was a fiction that served everyone. It kept him close enough to Ned to receive information. It kept him obscure enough that no one of consequence would look twice. Ghost did not like the column. Ghost did not like any of this. The direwolf walked beside Jon's horse with his ears flat and his tail low, and his red eyes tracking the gold cloaks with the focused attention of an animal that had already sorted 200 people into categories it did not share. Occasionally a horse would catch Ghost's scent and go sideways in its traces, and the rider would curse, and Ghost would look at Jon with an expression that communicated clearly that this was everyone else's problem, not his. "He's going to cause an incident," Robb had said, when they'd parted at Winterfell's gate. He had gripped Jon's arm at the elbow, the way their father did, and his face had done something complicated that he hadn't had words for. He already bit one of the gold cloaks. The gold cloak put his hand on him first. Jon had said. Robb had almost smiled. Still, he was 6 hours south of that conversation now, and Winterfell was already out of sight behind the first long fold of the land, and the castle felt less like something he'd left and more like something that had been removed. He did not let himself look back. Robert Baratheon rode at the head of the procession on a gray destrier that was doing visible work not to show how much it disliked its rider's weight. Robert rode like a man who had once been excellent at it and now treated the horse as furniture, one hand loose on the reins, the other wrapped around a wineskin that a page refilled every time it went light. Ned rode at his right hand. Jon watched them from 50 yards back. He had been watching them since the column formed, with the sustained, quiet attention he had developed over 20 years of being the person who sat at the wrong end of every table, the person who had to learn things by watching rather than being told. They laughed. That was the thing he had not expected. He had braced himself for something more formal, more charged. The king and his hand, titles and distance between them. Instead, Robert would say something Jon couldn't hear at this distance, and Ned would tilt his head in that particular way that meant he was trying not to smile, and Robert would slap his knee and roar loud enough that the nearest gold cloaks looked over and then decided, one by one, that they had seen nothing. Old friends. Men who had gone to war together when they were young and stupid and certain. Men who had survived something together which was different from having been through the same thing. Jon thought, that is the man who killed my father. He held the thought the way you hold something that has an edge. Carefully, aware of it, not gripping too hard. He had been doing this since the crypts. Taking the knowledge out, examining it in the light, putting it back, Aegon Targaryen, the Dragon Prince, his father. He had said the word father in the dark below Winterfell, and it had felt wrong in his mouth, like a word in a language he didn't speak. He was still working on it. Robert Baratheon killed Aegon Targaryen at the Trident. Robert Baratheon now sat the Iron Throne. Robert Baratheon was currently laughing at something Ned had said, his massive shoulders shaking, his red face tipped back toward the pale northern sky. Jon did not know what to do with any of this yet, so he watched, and he filed, and he waited. The first time Jaime Lannister looked at him, Jon was not ready for it. He had prepared himself for the Queen. Cersei Lannister had the kind of face you prepared yourself for, sharp and assembled and radiating the specific energy of a person who was always thinking something other than what she was saying. He had catalogued her from a distance with the same systematic care he applied to everything, And he had arrived at a simple conclusion. She was dangerous the way a blade laid flat on a table was dangerous. Not aimed at anything yet, but capable of being picked up quickly. Jaime was something different. He rode parallel to the Lannister column in his white cloak, moving along the column's edge the way water moves along a channel, without apparent effort, but going exactly where he intended. He was the best-looking man Jon had ever seen, and he wore this fact with the total indifference of someone who had been told it so many times it had lost all meaning. The white cloak of the Kingsguard hung from his shoulders without a wrinkle. His hand rested on his sword hilt, with a practiced looseness that Jon recognized because he had spent years developing a version of the same thing. The grip of someone who has drawn so many times that the motion has become reflex. Who could kill you before the decision to kill registered consciously? Jaime looked at Jon the way a man looks at something that has moved in his peripheral vision. Not with intent, with assessment. The assessment lasted 3 seconds. Then Jaime looked away, apparently satisfied. Jon noted the speed of it. 3 seconds was not nothing. 3 seconds meant the Kingslayer had found something that required 3 seconds to categorize, and that he had categorized it eventually, and that Jon would need to know which category that was. He made a note of this in the part of himself that was keeping notes on everything now. Ghost found the rabbit on his own, somewhere in the gray dusk beyond the camp's firelight, and brought it back without being asked. He set it at Jon's feet with the precision of a gift, and sat back on his haunches and watched Jon with those red eyes that caught the firelight and made them look like something burning deep inside old ice. Jon scratched behind Ghost's ears. The direwolf closed his eyes and leaned into it with a slow, heavy pressure, the way he always did, like he was trying to push through the hand to something beyond it. "He's enormous." The voice came from his left. Jon looked up. A young man was crouching at the edge of his firelight, golden-haired, with his mother's green eyes and the beginning of his father's jaw. His other father's jaw, Jon corrected himself silently. The Lannister jaw, watching Ghost with an expression caught somewhere between fascination and wariness. Joffrey Baratheon was 12 years old and already understood that other people existed to arrange themselves around his needs. "He is," Jon said. "What's his name?" "Ghost." Joffrey looked at Jon. He had a habit of looking at people from slightly under his brow, a look that was probably meant to seem commanding, and instead read as someone who had been taught that contempt was authority and hadn't yet noticed those were different things. "You're the bastard, Ned Stark's baseborn." "I'm Lord Stark's secretary," Jon said. His voice came out level and completely empty of anything that could be called offense. "Jon Snow?" "Snow?" Joffrey let the surname sit in his mouth for a moment, tasting whatever he thought the joke was. "What's it like?" he said. "Not knowing who your mother is." He thought about Lyanna's stone face in the crypt. He thought about a bed of blood and a whispered promise and 3 knights who had died on tower steps for the child she had been carrying. "Clarifying," Jon said. Joffrey blinked. The word had not done what he'd expected. Ghost opened his eyes. He looked at Joffrey with a slow, comprehensive attention that was worse than aggression. The direwolf did not growl. He simply looked, and what the look communicated required no translation. Joffrey stood. He pulled his cloak tighter with the practiced dignity of someone who needed it to not look like retreat. "Keep that animal away from the horses," he said, and walked back toward the firelight of the main camp. Jon watched him go. He thought, that boy is going to inherit a throne he has no right to. He thought, I know that because I know what his father's jawline looks like. He put another piece of wood on the fire and did not say either of these things to anyone. They crossed the neck in thin gray rain that had started the night before and showed no ambition to stop. Moat Cailin came out of the mist on the horizon first as a smear, then as broken towers, then as the thing it actually was. 3 of the original towers still standing above waterline, the rest collapsed into the boggy ground around them, the whole structure half reclaimed by the marshland that the Cranod men had been using as a weapon for thousands of years. It guarded the land passage south from the north. Every Stark who had ever ridden this road had passed beneath whatever remained of those towers. Jon rode under the broken arch and felt the north end. It was not dramatic. There was no line in the ground. The road simply continued, and the sky continued, and the rain continued, and the column ground on through the mud with all its noise and weight and politics. But something changed in the quality of the air on the other side, or perhaps in the quality of Jon's awareness of the air. The smell of pine and cold granite that he had breathed his entire life thinned and disappeared, replaced by something wetter, greener, more complicated. The Riverlands. Thousands of years of other people's wars soaked into the soil. Ghost stopped at the threshold of the arch and stood there for a long moment, his white coat dark with rain, his nose working at whatever the south was telling him. Then he crossed, because Jon had crossed, and he went where Jon went. Jon looked back once, not at Winterfell. Winterfell was 9 days behind him and invisible. He looked at the towers of Moat Cailin, at the border between the only world he had known and the one he was entering, at the wet gray line of the north receding behind the column. He turned back to the road. His father's rubies were somewhere ahead of him, scattered across a river ford where a war had ended and another slower one had quietly begun. He was riding toward them whether he wanted to or not. He touched the inside of his wrist, where his pulse moved steadily beneath the skin, and kept riding. The north is cold and full of whispers. The Patreon link is in the description, exclusive lore, alternate timelines, and the full logic Bible for this story. Now, we are at the river. The small folk called it the Ruby Ford. They had been calling it that for 15 years, since the day a king's hammer had come down on a crown prince's chest and scattered the rubies from his armor across the current. Fishermen still waded the shallows sometimes, working their feet through the silt, looking. Most found nothing. Some found red glass and convinced themselves it was something else. Occasionally, Jon had heard someone pulled a genuine ruby from the riverbed and spent the rest of their life arguing with people who didn't believe them. He stood at the bank and looked at the water. The column had stopped for the midday rest. Horses watered, food distributed, the complicated machinery of a royal progress momentarily at rest. The Red Fork ran maybe 30 yards across at this crossing, shallow enough to ford on foot, and shallow enough that standing here, Jon could see the rocks on the bottom through the current. Brown rock, green weed, ordinary river silt. He knew with a cold and mathematical certainty that his father had died in this water. Not here exactly. Upstream somewhere, where the river bent, where Robert Baratheon's warhammer had caved in Rhaegar Targaryen's chest, and the river had turned briefly red with something other than clay, he thought about the rubies still down there, scattered in the silt. He thought about them the way you think about something you can feel but cannot see. Their presence registered somewhere below conscious thought, in the soles of his feet through his boots, in the cold air coming off the current. His father. He was still learning that word. It sat in his mouth like a stone, too large, too heavy, an object his tongue kept finding and not knowing what to do with. Rhaegar Targaryen had stood somewhere near this ford and died for a war that had started because he had loved Lyanna Stark, had died not knowing she was carrying a child, had died not knowing his son would stand here 15 years later trying to understand how to grieve someone he had never been allowed to know he had lost. Ghost put his nose against Jon's palm, cold and wet and insistent. "I know," Jon said quietly. He turned away from the river. The camp stretched behind him along the bank, and through the noise of it, horses, men, the rhythmic clank of armor being adjusted, the distant sound of someone laughing too loudly, he heard something smaller, something that sounded like home. Arya was teaching Micah a grip she had gotten wrong. Jon watched from a distance behind a stand of alder trees and felt something unknot slightly in his chest. His sister's dark hair was loose and she was frowning the way she always frowned when she was concentrating. A single line between her brows, her mouth pressed flat, and she kept making Micah take the stick again and adjust his hands, and then shaking her head and making him do it again. The butcher's boy was laughing. Arya told him to stop laughing and grip from the wrist, not the fist, and he laughed harder. Jon had taught her that grip. He remembered it clearly. A morning in Winterfell's yard, Arya furious that Robb and Theon got practice swords, and she got nothing, Jon quietly cutting a stick to length and showing her the basics before anyone who mattered could object. He had not known, standing in Winterfell's yard, that he was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen. He was not certain what difference it would have made if he had. He stepped out from the trees and walked toward them, and Arya looked up with the immediate animal alertness of someone who had been startled, and then recognized him and shoved the expression down into something more dignified. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said. "I didn't say you were. You were going to. I was going to ask if Micah's grip had improved." Jon looked at the butcher's boy, who was red-faced and earnest and trying to look like he hadn't been laughing. "Has it? A little," Arya said with the generosity of someone who considered a little significant praise. Micah was trying to demonstrate the grip and not quite achieving it, and Arya was reaching out to adjust his hands again when the sound of hoofbeats came from the bank above them. Jon went still. He knew the sound of those particular hooves, heavier than necessary, a horse being ridden to impress rather than to travel, before the rider appeared at the top of the bank. Joffrey Baratheon came down toward the river with Sansa at his side and 2 hound-shadowed guards behind him. Joffrey saw Arya first. His expression went through something quick and unpleasant, recognition, then the calculation of someone who sees an opportunity and is already deciding how to take it. He looked at Micah with the flat, inventorying gaze of a boy who had grown up in a world where other people's discomfort was entertainment. Lion's tooth was at his hip, the gilded sword, short and sharp, a real blade worn by a boy who had never needed to use one. Jon stepped forward. He did not do it quickly. He did not do it with his hand near his own sword. He simply moved from where he was standing to a position between Joffrey and the 2 children, and stopped, and waited, with his hands loose at his sides and his feet planted at shoulder width in the way that Sir Roderick had drilled into him from the age of 7, the stance of a man who has decided where he is and is not planning to be anywhere else. Joffrey's eyes moved to him, narrowed. "Your Grace," Jon said. He made the honorific immaculate, not warm, not cold, not laden with anything that could be called offense, just accurate and correct and completely devoid of the deference that would have made it comfortable. "The footings poor along the bank, the rain last week. Your horse will have better ground 20 yards upstream." Joffrey blinked. He had been prepared for flinching. He had been prepared for scrambling, for the sudden straightening of people who remembered where they were in the order of things. He had not been prepared for this. A man who acknowledged his rank completely and refused to move in the same breath. "I know where the ground is," Joffrey said. "Of course," Jon agreed. "I mention it only in service of your Grace's convenience." Joffrey's jaw tightened. Sansa, behind him, had gone very still in the particular way of a girl who understood that something was happening and did not yet know what. She was watching Jon with an expression he could not fully read. Not fear exactly, more like the focused attention of someone recalibrating. "That's the butcher's brat," Joffrey said, looking past Jon at Micah. "He's been playing at nights again. It's not appropriate." "Children play," Jon said. "It's one of the few things they're better at than the rest of us." The reply landed cleanly. Joffrey heard it, felt it, and could not locate the insult inside it because there wasn't one, not technically, not provably. Jon had said nothing offensive. He had said nothing that could be reported to anyone as anything other than reasonable. And yet Joffrey understood, with the animal instinct of someone who had been using social power as a weapon since before he could articulate what power was, that this bastard secretary had just moved him off a target and he had gone, and he did not know how to undo it without drawing a sword on a man who wasn't armed. He looked at Jon for a long moment, then at Arya, then back at Jon. Nymeria padded out from behind Arya's legs and sat beside Ghost. 2 direwolves, one gray and one white, looking at Joffrey Baratheon with the patient and complete attention of animals that did not experience rank. Joffrey turned his horse. "Keep the animals away from the camp," he said, and rode back up the bank. Sansa lingered for a moment. She looked at Arya with an expression that was complicated in ways Jon suspected she didn't have words for yet. Then she followed Joffrey. Arya let out a breath. He was going to... "I know," Jon said. He had his hand on... "I know." He looked at her. "Go back to camp. Both of you, take the long way past the supply wagons." Arya looked like she wanted to argue. Then she looked at his face and didn't. Lady was alive. Both direwolves were alive. He stood on the bank of the Trident, where his father had died, and watched his sister walk away through the alder trees, and thought, one thing at a time. The summons came through a servant, which was how Cersei Lannister communicated everything she wanted to appear casual. Her pavilion was larger than Ned's. It smelled of rosewater and the particular expensive beeswax of southern candles, and it was arranged with the careful informality of a space designed to make visitors feel that nothing formal was happening. 2 chairs near a low brazier, a table with wine already poured. Cersei sitting with her hands folded and her expression open in a way that Jon recognized immediately as the most dangerous kind of closed. "Jon Snow," she said, "sit down." He sat. She poured the second cup herself, which was a choice designed to feel like warmth. She had been doing things like this his entire life, he suspected. Small, precise gestures that created the sensation of intimacy without the reality of it. "You handled Joffrey well," she said. "Earlier, at the river." "I did nothing, Your Grace." "Yes." She looked at him with those green eyes that were beautiful and busy at the same time. That was what was interesting about it. She let that sit. Jon let it sit with her. He had learned, early and well, that the person who needed to fill a silence was the person with less patience, and he had spent 20 years developing patience the way other men developed sword arms. "How old are you?" she said. 20, Your Grace." "You seem older." She tilted her head. "Lord Stark's secretary. It's an unusual position for a young man of your, a half-beat, background. Lord Stark needed someone he could trust, and he trusts you." "Yes. Why?" Jon looked at her steadily. "He raised me." Cersei considered this. She lifted her cup and did not drink from it immediately. She held it in the way of someone accustomed to having things in hand. "Your mother," she said. "She was northern. She died when I was born, Your Grace. I don't know much about her. Lord Stark has never said." "No, not even to you. Lord Stark is a man of honor," Jon said. Something moved across Cersei's face so quickly that Jon almost missed it. Almost. It was gone before it arrived. A flicker behind those green eyes, something that tasted the word honor and found it both accurate and contemptible, the way a person finds something contemptible precisely because they cannot dismiss it. "Yes," she said, "he is." The word honor sat between them like a blade someone had set on the table, without explaining why it was there. Cersei looked at him for a long moment. She was looking at something specific, Jon realized. Not his face in general, but some particular part of it. His eyes, maybe, or the line of his jaw. Something she was trying to place it. "You're very controlled," she said. "For someone your age, most young men at court spend their first months trying to make themselves seen." She paused. "You seem to be trying to do the opposite." "I'm here to serve Lord Stark," Jon said, "not the court. And if those came into conflict, then I'd serve Lord Stark." She smiled. It was a real smile, which was more unsettling than a false one would have been. "Honest," she said. "I appreciate honesty. It's so rare here that it reads as a kind of weapon." She set her cup down. "You may go." He did not look back. Behind him, Cersei Lannister sat very still, with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the space he had occupied and thought about what she had seen in it. She could not name what was wrong with Jon Snow. She had been reading men since before she had words for what she was doing, and she could not find the shape of this one. A bastard secretary should be hungry, should be reaching, angling, performing, looking for the gap between ranks where a man without a name could insert himself. This one was not doing any of those things. He was waiting for what she did not yet know. But she had been in rooms with waiting men before, and she had learned that the question was never whether they would move, only when. She reached for her cup. The smell arrived before the city did. Jon had been warned about this by no one because no one who lived in King's Landing thought it was worth mentioning anymore. The way people who lived near tanneries stopped noticing leather and rot. The column was still a mile out when it hit. 500,000 people living on a hill above a river, their waste finding its way downward with the same patient persistence as water, layering itself into the clay and the channels and the air above everything, until the air itself became a record of what the city ate and burned and expelled and left to rot in the summer heat. Ghost made a sound Jon had never heard from him before. Not a growl. Something lower and more fundamental than a growl, a sound that began in the chest and stayed there, like a millstone turning. "I know," Jon said. The direwolf walked with his tail rigid and his ears rotated forward, tracking something in the noise and stench that required all of his attention. He had been wrong-footed since they crossed the neck. Everything south of the neck had been too loud, too hot, too densely populated with people and animals whose smells overlapped into a continuous wall of information. King's Landing was the wall made solid. The Red Keep rose above the city the way a bruise rises, not suddenly, but inevitably, the color preceding the shape. The red-brown stone visible before the towers resolved into individual structures. It dominated the hill at the city's eastern edge with the self-evidence of something that had always been there and expected to remain. 7 towers. Walls thick enough to lose a man inside, built for a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries and ended in a single afternoon, built by Jon's ancestors. He looked at it without expression and filed that fact in the part of himself where he kept the things he could not yet do anything with. He dreamed of fire, not the fire of hearths or forges, not the controlled, useful fire of a kitchen or a smithy, something vast and ancient, something that breathed. He was standing in a space he could not identify, below something, below a great weight of stone, and all around him in the dark were shapes enormous and still, and the fire came from him, from inside his chest, pushing outward through his ribs as if his bones were the bars of a cage holding something that was finished waiting. He woke with the smell of it still in his lungs. Ghost was in the corner of the room, sitting upright, watching him with those red eyes that caught the gray pre-dawn light through the narrow window and made them look like something burning deep inside old ice. The direwolf had not moved. He was simply watching with the patience of an animal that had been awake longer than Jon and had reached conclusions Jon had not yet arrived at. Jon sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Somewhere below him, he did not know how far, but below, in the deep stone of the Red Keep's foundations, there were skulls. He did not know this yet with any certainty, but something in the dream had known it. Something had been reaching downward through the floor toward a darkness that breathed back. He dressed in the gray light and did not go back to sleep. A bastard secretary was invisible. Jon had understood this theoretically before arriving. He understood it practically now, in the way you understand things that have been demonstrated to you daily for a fortnight. In the hallways of the Red Keep, men looked past him the way they looked past furniture. He registered as part of the background, correctly categorized as unimportant, filed and forgotten in the time it took a courtier's gaze to move from one lord to the next. He was too young to be a threat, too baseborn to be worth cultivating, too associated with the hand to be worth antagonizing. He existed in a gap between categories that was, it turned out, extraordinarily useful. He could go to the records room without anyone asking why. The records room was 3 floors below the Tower of the Hand, a long chamber with vaulted ceilings and shelves cut directly into the stone. Ledgers, correspondence, household accounts, lineage records, the administrative sediment of 300 years of court life layered into the shelves like geological strata. The maester who maintained it was 70 years old and slept in a chair near the door in the afternoons, his chin on his chest, his breath slow and regular, and completely uninterested in what a secretary was doing among the older shelves. Jon had been coming here every other day for 2 weeks. He had started, as Ned had asked, with Jon Arryn's death. The former hand had fallen ill with a sudden fever 6 months before. A summer sickness, the maesters had recorded, the language deliberately non-specific. Jon had pulled the household records from the months before Arryn's death, read them with the patience of someone who had nothing else he was supposed to be doing, and found the thing that Arryn had been doing in the weeks before he died. He had been visiting smithies, not as the hand of the king, without retinue, without announcement, in simple clothes that made him a lord traveling incognito to anyone paying attention. 3 smithies in the city, 1 in the Street of Steel, 2 in the lower city near the harbor. Jon had visited all 3. At the 3rd, he had found a boy. The boy's name was Gendry. He was perhaps 15, broad on the shoulders in the way of someone who had been swinging a hammer since he was old enough to lift one, with black hair and blue eyes and a jaw that Jon had stood in front of for a full minute before he'd been able to make himself move. The jaw was Robert Baratheon's jaw, not similar to it, not reminiscent of it. The jaw transplanted into a face that was also unmistakably and completely Robert Baratheon's face. The boy had looked back at Jon with the slightly suspicious expression of someone accustomed to being stared at by strangers, who then asked questions he didn't know how to answer. "Something wrong with the work?" he'd said, gesturing at the blade cooling in the water trough. "No," Jon had said, "the work's good." He had bought the blade and carried it back to the Red Keep and sat with it in his chamber for a long time, turning it over in his hands, thinking about a book he had found on the 3rd shelf of the records room. The lineages and histories of the great houses of the 7 kingdoms. He had read the Baratheon section 3 times. Black hair, blue eyes, strong of bone, generation after generation, the same description repeating like a law of nature. Because it was a law of nature, the Baratheon blood dominant and consistent and apparently incapable of producing anything other than what it was. Robert's acknowledged bastards were scattered through the city and the surrounding area, and every account he'd found described them the same way. Joffrey Baratheon had green eyes and golden hair. Jon had put the blade down and looked out the window at the city. He knew with a cold and complete certainty what it meant when a child didn't look like its father. Ned read the notes Jon had written without speaking. He read them the way he read everything, steadily, with total attention, his face giving nothing away during the reading itself. Jon had learned to wait. He sat in the chair across from his father, his uncle, and watched the candles and listened to the city outside the window, the noise of it never fully stopping, and waited. Ned set the notes down. He did not look at them again. He looked at Jon with an expression that Jon could not fully categorize. Not surprise, not exactly, more like a man who has heard a sound in the dark and has now had it confirmed as what he suspected. Where did you find the lineage book? Ned said. Records room. Third shelf, north wall. It's been there for years. Jon paused. Jon Arryn was reading it. The same book, in the months before he died. Ned closed his eyes briefly, one breath. Then he opened them. The boy at the smithy. His mother worked in an alehouse. She's dead. Someone paid his apprentice fee anonymously. Jon watched his father's face. He looks exactly like the king, Ned. Standing next to any description of Robert's other bastards, he looks exactly like them. And Joffrey? He stopped. Doesn't, Ned said. Doesn't. The candles moved. The city went on existing outside the window, indifferent to what was being understood in this room. You're certain, Ned said. The book covers 300 years of Baratheon marriages, Valyrian wives, Reach wives, Lannister wives. Every combination produces the same children. Black hair. The seed doesn't break. Jon looked at his father steadily. It's not certain the way a confession is certain, but it's certain the way mathematics is certain. Ned looked at the notes again without picking them up. His hands were flat on the desk, still, and Jon could see the tendons across the back of them, the slight, barely perceptible tightening of a man keeping himself very controlled. You understand, Ned said quietly, what this means. If this is true, if the Crown Prince is not Robert's son, I understand. You understand that Jon Arryn knew this, and Jon Arryn is dead. Yes, and you still pulled this thread. Jon looked at him. Someone had to. Ned was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, crossed to the window, and looked out at King's Landing, at the lights of 500,000 people living their lives on the hill below the Red Keep, none of them knowing what was being discussed in the tower above them. There's someone I need to speak to, he said finally. Carefully, and you. He turned. You stop. You found what needs to be found. You don't pull this thread any further until I tell you otherwise. Who are you going to speak to? Ned's expression was not one Jon had seen on him before. It was the expression he would later understand of a man who has realized that the city he has come to is considerably more dangerous than he accounted for, and that the only path through it runs directly toward the people who made it dangerous. Someone who already knows, Ned said, and has been waiting to see how long it takes us. Petyr Baelish was waiting in the corridor outside. Jon nearly walked into him. The man was standing in the shadow of a doorway with a quality of stillness that was not the stillness of someone being subtle, but of someone who had decided that being visible in the dark was itself a statement. He was shorter than his reputation suggested, with a pointed beard and a mockingbird pin at his collar, and eyes the color of sea foam that were doing too much work behind an expression of easy warmth. Jon Snow, Baelish said. He smiled as though they had an appointment. I was hoping to run into you. Jon stopped. He made sure to stop at a distance that was neither aggressive nor accommodating, far enough to see clearly, close enough to seem unafraid. Lord Baelish. Just Littlefinger, please. Lord Baelish makes me feel like my father. He fell into step beside Jon in the direction Jon had not yet chosen to walk, which was a technique, the implication of shared destination, of familiarity. I've been watching you settle in. You're doing it wrong, you know. Settling in? Staying invisible. Baelish's tone was pleasant, instructive, completely false in the specific way of a man who has never given anyone useful information accidentally. In this city, invisibility just means you're a resource no one has claimed yet. It doesn't mean you're safe, it means you're available. Jon considered this. And you'd like to claim the resource? Baelish smiled. It was a real smile, which was worse. I'd like to be useful. I knew Lady Stark, your lord's wife, when we were young, grew up together almost. I have great affection for her family. He let that breathe for a moment, let Jon hear the word affection and understand that it was the most precisely chosen word in the sentence. I thought as a courtesy to that connection I might offer you some orientation. Jon let the silence sit between them before he responded, long enough to make Baelish aware that he'd noticed it was being offered. That's generous, he said. It's entirely selfish, Baelish said cheerfully. Honest men are so useful. They reached a junction in the corridor. Jon stopped. Baelish stopped with him, and Jon watched the man's face for what arrived in the instant when he realized the conversation was ending before he was ready. A flicker quickly managed the briefest rearrangement of the warmth into something more evaluative. Thank you for the offer, Jon said. I'll keep it in mind. He walked back toward his chamber. Behind him, Petyr Baelish stood at the junction and watched him go, and his expression did something that would have been difficult to name from across a corridor, something that was not quite reassessment, but was adjacent to it. The resource, it seemed, had opinions about being claimed. He tucked this away and walked the other direction, thinking, Jon had been using the yard for 3 weeks before anyone important noticed. He came in the hour after dawn, when the yard was occupied mostly by gold cloaks rotating off night watch and household knights fulfilling the formality of morning exercise. No one who mattered trained this early. The knights who mattered trained at mid-morning, after a proper breakfast, when there was an audience worth performing for. Jon trained early precisely because of this. He could work without being watched, without the social arithmetic of who was observing and what conclusions they were drawing. He had chosen a gold cloak named Harwin, a capable man, experienced, with good footwork and the particular stubbornness of someone who had learned to fight in real conditions rather than tournaments. Harwin did not hold back because Jon was a secretary. Harwin held back slightly because Jon was better than him, and men who are slightly outmatched spend energy they should spend on execution managing the fact of it instead. Jon was aware of this. He was aware of most things that happened in a yard. He came in low off the left side of Harwin's overhead cut, inside the swing's arc where the power was already spent, and put his practice sword against the man's ribs at the exact point where real steel would have opened the lung. Harwin grunted. Reset. Jon reset opposite him and waited. Again, Jon said. He was not watching the man who had come to stand at the rail. He was aware of him. He had been aware of him since the man arrived. The sound of a particular kind of boot on stone, the specific quality of attention that some people carried ahead of them like a change in pressure. Jon had learned at Winterfell that the most dangerous people in a room were not the loudest ones. He had filed the presence at the rail and continued working, and continued to not look at it, which was its own kind of looking. Harwin came again. Jon let him set the rhythm this time, let 3 exchanges develop at Harwin's pace, so the man could feel what he was actually doing rather than what Jon's speed was forcing him to do. Then Jon stepped off the line. Not back, sideways, a 45-degree displacement that Harwin's arm couldn't follow without rebuilding his grip, and ended it. That's enough, said a voice from the rail. Jon looked up. Sir Barristan Selmy was 70 years old, and looked, in the training yard, like something that had been distilled rather than aged. He was lean in the way of a blade that has been repeatedly tempered, not thin, not diminished, but reduced to what was essential and left harder for the reduction. His white cloak hung from shoulders that had carried it for decades. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and they were doing, Jon understood immediately, what Jon's own eyes had been doing all morning. They were counting. Lord Stark's secretary, Barristan said. It was not a question. He already knew. Sir Barristan, Jon said. The old knight regarded him for a moment from the rail. Then he descended the 2 steps into the yard with the unhurried ease of someone who did not think about how they moved anymore. Harwin saw who it was, and found somewhere else to be with impressive speed. Spare a few minutes for an old man, Barristan said. Jon looked at him. You're the Lord Commander of the King's Guard. And you're a secretary. Barristan's mouth moved slightly. We're both here earlier than we're supposed to be. It evens out. He picked up a practice sword from the rack with the automatic, unsentimental familiarity of someone for whom the object was as ordinary as a spoon. He tested the balance with one small rotation of his wrist, a gesture so brief it was barely visible, and turned to face Jon across the packed dirt. Jon raised his sword. It lasted 11 minutes. Jon knew because he counted. It was something Sir Roderick had taught him early. Count when you're fighting. Count as a discipline against the panic that makes men sloppy. Count because time is information and information is the difference between surviving and not. He did not come close to winning. This was not a surprise. What was a surprise was the nature of losing. Barristan Selmy did not beat him with power. Jon had fought men with more raw strength than the old knight carried. He beat him with angles. Every time Jon committed to a strike, the space he was striking into had already been vacated, and Barristan's blade had arrived somewhere else with the quiet inevitability of a door closing. Jon tried adjustment after adjustment, shortened his grip, changed his weight distribution, attacked in combinations rather than single strikes, and each adjustment was met with a corresponding one that cost Barristan nothing and cost Jon ground. Twice, Jon forced him to do real work. Twice, Barristan gave a slight additional quality of attention to what he was doing, and Jon felt it in the subtle shift of the man's weight. A gathering. After 11 minutes, Barristan put his blade against the side of Jon's neck with enough precision that Jon could feel the angle of it, not touching a finger's width away, and held it there. They both breathed. Stillness, Barristan said. He lowered the blade. You go very still before you commit. Most fighters give something away in movement, a shoulder drop, a grip adjustment. You give nothing, you simply stop, and then you act. He tilted his head. Where did you learn that? Ser Roderick Cassel, Jon said. At Winterfell. Barristan considered this. Ser Roderick Cassel was a good man. A sound teacher, he was quiet for a moment, studying Jon with an expression that was working at something it couldn't quite close. And yet, he did not finish the sentence. He returned his practice sword to the rack and stood beside Jon in the relative quiet of the early yard, and looked out at the red keep's walls with the expression of a man listening to something Jon couldn't hear. He trained a great many young men, Barristan said finally. Not Sir Roderick. The subject had shifted, the way a man's subject shifts when he is talking about one thing while thinking about another. Aegon Targaryen. He had a particular way of training, not just the forms, but the philosophy behind them. He believed stillness was the warrior's highest discipline, that a man who could be still could see everything. He paused. I've been watching you train for 2 weeks. I know, Jon said. Barristan looked at him sideways. Something shifted in the pale blue eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. Yes, he said. I suppose you do. They stood against the wall in the shade of the battlements above, not quite sitting, not quite at ease, in the way of two men who have established that they are willing to be in the same space without it requiring explanation. Barristan talked about Rhaegar the way men talked about weather that had fundamentally changed their lives, not with effort, not performing grief, just with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting what was real. He had not intended to talk about Rhaegar. Jon could see the moment the name had arrived before Barristan chose to say it, and the moment Barristan had decided not to take it back. He played the harp, Barristan said. That's what people forget. The songs make him a warrior, which he was, but they leave out that he played. He would sit in the practice yard sometimes, not to train, just to sit, and play while the knights worked. He said it helped him think. The old knight's jaw moved slightly. He was always thinking about something he couldn't quite say out loud. A man carrying a prophecy he doesn't know what to do with. Jon looked at the harp. Barristan blinked. It was not the question he had expected. I don't know. Everything at the tower was. He stopped. Lost. Most things were lost. I'm sorry, Jon said. And he was. He was startled to discover how much he was. Grief for a harp he had never heard, for a man he had never met, for the specific and ordinary details that wars consumed along with everything else. He pressed this down and kept his face settled. Barristan looked at him. You're an unusual young man, he said. Not warmly, not coldly. As a measurement. People keep saying that. Jaime Lannister arrived when the yard had filled with the mid-morning crowd. He came in his white cloak with his golden sword hand, and that specific quality of physical grace that Jon had been watching and cataloging since the column had left Winterfell. The grace of someone who had been told since childhood that they were the best and had inconveniently turned out to actually be the best, which removed the useful friction of insecurity and left only the pure product. He watched Jon and Barristan at the wall for a moment, and something arranged itself in his face. He crossed the yard. Sell me, he said. Then, to Jon, Snow, he said the surname with the same particular intonation people used for it in the north. Not contemptuous exactly, more like the careful neutrality of someone demonstrating they know what it means. I saw the spar. Most men last 4 minutes with him. He was generous, Jon said. 11 minutes isn't generous. 11 minutes is him being genuinely interested. Jaime looked at Jon with the green eyes that were his sister's and nothing like his children's. The stillness. Where did you pick that up? A long time of being watched, Jon said. You learn to give nothing away when you know someone's always looking. Jaime looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite a smile and not quite its absence. A long time of being watched, he repeated. Is there something I can help you with, Sir Jaime? The Kingslayer studied him. Jon could feel the quality of it, the same 3-second assessment from the road, now extended. Jaime was looking for the angle and not finding it, and the absence of an angle was itself information. No, Jaime said finally. He picked up a practice sword from the rack and turned toward the center of the yard. Just checking the inventory. He walked away. Jon watched him go and noted the word inventory and filed it. Barristan had waited. Jon returned to the wall and found the old knight still there, his pale eyes on the far end of the yard, his expression the particular blankness of someone who has been thinking rather than resting. He did not acknowledge Jaime's departure. He seemed to have forgotten Jaime entirely. "You asked me a question," Barristan said. "Before, about the harp." He was quiet for a moment. No one asks about the harp. They ask about the trident, about the swordwork, about whether he really loved. He stopped. They ask about the things that make for good songs. You asked about the harp. Jon waited. He would have been different, Barristan said, if he had lived. If the rebellion had not, if things had gone differently. He said this with a weight behind it that Jon recognized as a man choosing inadequate words because the adequate ones were too exposed. Robert is what he is, a man who won a war and discovered that winning a war was the best thing he would ever do. Everything since has been smaller. He paused. Rhaegar would have been different. Different how? Jon said. Barristan looked at him. The pale blue eyes moved across Jon's face with a slow, comprehensive attention that Jon held himself very still under. The old knight was not looking at him. He understood. He was looking for something he almost recognized, that kept arriving at the edge of recognition and not completing it. "Better," Barristan said finally. "I think, better." He pushed off the wall. "Go read your book, Snow." He walked back across the yard in his white cloak. Jon stayed at the wall and watched him go. He thought about what it meant. Better coming from a man who had stood beside kings for 50 years and found them all insufficient. He thought about 3 knights who had died in a Dornish tower to protect the child of the man Barristan was grieving, and whether that grief was the same as loyalty, or whether they were different words for the same direction. He thought about a harp that had been lost in a war. He stayed at the wall a long time after Barristan had gone, in the noise and heat of the mid-morning yard, and let none of it show on his face. Ghost led him there. Jon had learned, over 20 years of living alongside the direwolf, to read the difference between Ghost's hunting attention and his other attention. The attention he gave to things that were not prey and not threat, but something without a category. Something that required investigation for reasons that did not translate into human language. He had seen it twice before. Once outside Winterfell's walls in a winter storm when Ghost had stood facing north for an hour without moving, and once at the Trident when the direwolf had gone to the water's edge and stood there with his nose lifted and his red eyes fixed on the current. Tonight, Ghost had been pacing the chamber for an hour before Jon stopped pretending to sleep and followed him. 3 floors down, then 4. The stairs narrowed as they descended past the levels Jon had been to. The records room, the storage vaults, the cold chambers where the castle's winter provisions were kept. Below those, the stone changed. Older, cut by different hands, in a different century, without the same attention to regularity. The blocks were enormous and irregular and fitted together without mortar, the way things were built when the builders had enough power that precision was an aesthetic choice rather than a structural necessity. Jon's torch found the door. Iron, wide enough to drive a cart through, hinges the size of his forearm, open, which meant either someone had been here recently or the door was never closed, and the darkness beyond it had the specific quality of a space that held its breath. Ghost walked through without hesitation. Jon followed. The largest skull was at the far end of the chamber, and it was the size of a house. Jon stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time before he could fully understand what he was seeing. His torch was small. The chamber was enormous. The skull resolved out of the darkness slowly, as his eyes adjusted, first as an absence, a space where the torchlight stopped arriving, and then as a shape, and then as the thing it was. Black bone. Ancient. The lower jaw displaced slightly, teeth the length of his forearm still seated in the sockets. The whole structure carrying the density of something that had been mineral long enough to have forgotten it was once alive. The name came to him without effort. Balerion, the Black Dread. Aegon the Conqueror's dragon, the creature that had melted the swords that made the Iron Throne, that had destroyed Harrenhal's towers by landing on them, that had lived for 2 centuries and been the largest dragon in recorded history. His ancestor's dragon. Jon walked into the room. The other skulls were arranged along the walls, smaller, most of them, though smaller was doing significant work in the context of objects that could have swallowed a horse entire. They diminished in size from Balerion's end toward the door. A record of the Targaryen dragons getting smaller and smaller across the generations as something went wrong with them in captivity, the bloodline of fire narrowing toward nothing. The last skulls near the door were almost modest, almost comprehensible. The first skull was not. Jon walked to Balerion and put his hand against the bone. He did not know why he did this. It was not a considered action. His hand simply arrived there, palm flat against the black surface that was cold and faintly rough and absolutely solid, and something happened in his chest that he did not have a word for. Not warmth. Not recognition in any ordinary sense. More like a string that had been wound tight for a long time, releasing a single note. A vibration that passed through the hand, up the arm, and settled somewhere behind the sternum, without resolving. Ghost sat at Jon's feet and looked up at Balerion's skull with those red eyes and said nothing. He had a particular way of standing in front of that one, said a soft voice from the doorway. Jon did not spin. He turned slowly with his hand still against the bone and looked at the man in the doorway. Varys was a small man who occupied a room entirely. He stood in the iron doorway in robes the color of ash, his bald head catching Jon's torchlight, his hands folded in front of him with the patient stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was the most efficient use of a body. His face was powdered, his expression pleasant, his eyes doing everything his expression was not. Aegon Targaryen, Varys continued, stepping into the room with soft, unhurried footsteps. He used to come down here at night. Before the rebellion, when this was a different city and these skulls had a different meaning, he tilted his head at Balerion. He said it helped him think. All that ancient certainty. He looked at Jon. My little birds tell me a great many things, Jon Snow. They told me someone was in the yard at dawn. They told me someone was in the records room 3 times this week. They told me someone was following a dire wolf through the lower cellars at the 11th hour. He paused. They did not have to tell me who. Ghost had not moved. He was watching Varys with the sustained, unreadable attention that he gave to things he had not yet categorized. You're not supposed to be here, Jon said. Nor are you. Varys smiled slightly. I find it's the rooms one isn't supposed to be in that contain the most useful information. He moved along the wall, his eyes on the skulls rather than Jon, with the careful appreciation of someone in a gallery. He had the Targaryen look entirely, you know, your father. Silver gold hair, the violet eyes. He was everything the dynasty looked like when it was at its best. Remarkable man. He stopped. You, of course, look nothing like him. You have your mother's coloring completely. The dark hair, the gray northern eyes, the stark look that sits in your face the same way it sat in Lyanna's. It's what has kept you hidden. When people see you, they see Ned Stark's north. Nothing else. He paused. Except some of us, who have learned to look at other things. You already knew, Jon said, about me, before I arrived. I suspected, Varys said. I've suspected for a long time. There are very few secrets in this city that outlast my curiosity. He looked at Jon with those precise, busy eyes. I knew what Ned Stark was protecting. I knew the shape of the secret even without its contents. A bastard raised too carefully, guarded too closely, with too much quiet attention paid to his education, and too little to his integration with the household he was supposed to belong to. A man who looked like a Stark, but who Ned Stark, a man of absolute honesty, could never quite speak about without choosing his words. He paused. And then I met you. And I'm no longer suspecting. Varys walked to a low stone ledge and sat with the unhurried ease of someone in his own study. Let me be direct with you. There is a version of this conversation where we both pretend we're discussing something else and leave with less than we came in with. I don't believe that version serves either of us. He looked at Jon. You are Aegon Targaryen's son. Jon said nothing. You don't need to confirm it, Varys said. Your hand on that skull said enough. He glanced at Balerion. The blood recognizes what the mind refuses. It's one of the few reliable tests. He returned to Jon. The question I've been asking myself for the past month, the question that required observation rather than information, is whether you are the right person. The right person for what? To not destroy everything. Varys said it simply, without drama, the way you say things that are plainly true. Daenerys Targaryen is across the narrow sea with 3 dragon eggs she doesn't yet know will hatch. A boy I have been. A small pause, something tightening and then releasing in his expression. Investing in, elsewhere, will not be what I hoped. These are realities I have spent years arranging around a particular outcome, and a man who stands in a skull cellar and puts his hand against Balerion's bone without any of the self-congratulation I would expect from a young man of dynastic significance has caused me to reassess that arrangement entirely. He looked at Jon directly. You don't want the throne. No, Jon said. That is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 30 years, Varys said, or the most sophisticated lie I've encountered." He was quiet for a moment. "Which is it?" "I don't know yet what I want," Jon said. "I know what I am. I know what the Lannisters are. I know what's coming if nothing changes." He looked at Varys steadily. "And I know that wanting a throne and being willing to use one are not the same thing." The seller held the distinction between them for a long moment. Varys looked at him. He looked at him the way he had looked at the skulls, with the attention of a man cataloging something real. Ghost finally moved, rising from his seated position and padding silently to Jon's side, and Varys watched the direwolf arrive there and did not look away from the wolf's red eyes. "A king who doesn't want to rule," Varys said, "is precisely what the realm needs. The ones who want it are the ones who break it." He stood, smoothing his robes. "I had a note prepared to send to certain parties. Regarding a certain investment," he reached into his robe and held up a small folded piece of paper. "I no longer need to send it." He set it on the stone ledge and left it there. "Consider this a beginning, Jon Snow. A provisional one. I have been wrong before and I will not pretend otherwise. But I find myself, for the first time in several years, looking in the right direction." He walked to the door. He stopped with his back to Jon, one hand on the iron frame. "Your father used to play the harp down here," Varys said quietly. "The acoustics carried the sound through the whole lower level. In the right conditions, standing at the top of the stairs, you could hear it. Most people thought it was the wind coming off the bay." He paused. "It wasn't." He left. Jon stood alone in the skull cellar with Ghost and a small folded piece of paper on a stone ledge and the black ancient bulk of Balerion filling the far wall of the chamber. He picked up the paper, unfolded it, read the 3 lines written in a neat, careful hand, addressed to someone whose name he didn't recognize, "In a city across the narrow sea." He read it twice. Then he held it to the torch and watched it burn. Ghost watched the ash drift down to the cellar floor and said nothing, and was satisfied. The note arrived under his door in the hour when the city was at its most honest. Too late for the taverns, too early for the markets, the window of darkness when people moved through King's Landing without performing anything. Jon was already awake. He had stopped pretending at sleep sometime around the 2nd hour, when Ghost had begun pacing again. Not the low-level unease the direwolf carried constantly in the city, but something with direction, something with urgency underneath it. He broke the seal. No signature. He had not expected one. The wine for the king's hunt has been prepared by the queen's own hand. 3 skins. The vintage is arbor gold. The vintage is not what it claims to be. The hunt leaves at dawn. Jon read it twice. Then he dressed, shoved the note into the brazier, and ran. He reached Ned Solar in time to learn he was too late for the only intervention that would have mattered. The steward at the door told him Lord Stark had ridden out before dawn. The king had insisted on an early start, earlier than planned. The household had assembled in darkness. The horses already saddled. The column had moved out through the king's gate before the city had properly woken. Jon stood in the corridor outside the closed Solar door. The hunt was in the Kingswood, a half-hour's hard ride from the city gates. By the time he mounted and reached the wood, the hunting party would be deep inside it, spread through the trees in the controlled chaos of a royal hunt, impossible to locate quickly, impossible to interrupt without creating exactly the kind of visible disruption that would require explanation. He could ride anyway. He could reach the wood and find them. He could find Ned and tell him what the note had said. He could not unsay the wine Robert Baratheon had already drunk. Ghost pressed against his leg. Jon looked down at the direwolf, at the red eyes that were tracking something Jon couldn't see, something that moved through the air in a direction Jon had no word for. He went to get his horse. He heard it before he reached them. Not the boar. The boar was already dead by then, killed by 6 spears and the hound's sword, bleeding out in the undergrowth 50 yards from where the hunting party had scattered and reassembled into the specific horrified stillness of people who have just watched something they cannot undo. Jon heard the voices first, the wrong register of them, men who were trying to sound controlled and weren't. He pushed his horse through the last line of trees and found Robert Baratheon lying on the ground, with his belly open. The boar had taken him low and left. The tusk had entered at the hip and traveled upward. And the wound it had left was the kind of wound that experienced men looked at and did not look away from because they were uncertain. They looked away because they were certain. Robert was conscious. That was somehow worse. He was lying on a cloak that someone had spread across the forest floor, and he was looking up at the canopy with the white, deeply focused expression of a man counting his own breaths. Ned was kneeling beside him. He had both hands pressed against the wound, with the flat pragmatism of a man who had been on enough battlefields to understand the gesture was more about presence than pressure. Jon dismounted. He walked to the edge of the group and stood. Robert's eyes found him through the surrounding faces. They focused, which was a surprise. "Snow," Robert said. His voice was thick but deliberate. "You are not supposed to be here." "No, Your Grace. Neither am I." Robert's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. Bloody boar came out of nowhere. 20 stone of pig and no manners at all. He breathed. The breath cost him something. "Ned." "I'm here," Ned said. "Don't let me die on the ground. Get me back." A pause. "And kill that pig. The pig is dead, Your Grace." "Good." Robert closed his eyes. "Good." He lasted 3 days. The maesters worked with the deliberate calm of men demonstrating competence, while privately concluding it was not enough. Milk of the poppy, wound drainage, poultices that smelled of pine tar, and something sweeter underneath. The wound had not nicked the bowel, which was the only reason 3 days was possible instead of 1, but it had opened enough blood vessels that the king's body was conducting a slow argument with itself about whether to continue. The argument was not going well. Jon came to the bedchamber on the second night, when the maesters had stepped back and Ned was sitting in the chair beside the bed, with the particular stillness of a man doing the hard work of being present. The room smelled of the poultices, and underneath them of something older, the specific unavoidable smell of a body beginning to inform on itself. Robert was awake. He saw Jon in the doorway and made a gesture with 2 fingers that might have been a beckoning or might have been a reflex, and Jon crossed to the foot of the bed and stood. "Sit down," Robert said. "You make me nervous, standing there like a crow." Robert looked at the ceiling for a while. The milk of the poppy had taken some of the pain and replaced it with a floating quality, a looseness around the eyes that turned his face into something younger and more honest. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about the trident." Ned's hands tightened slightly on the arms of the chair. "Not the battle," Robert said. "After, when it was done." He breathed. "I went to the water afterward, looking for something," a pause. "The rubies," from his armor. "I don't know what I thought I was going to do with them. Keep them. Throw them back." He turned his head on the pillow and looked at the far wall. "I found one. Just one. Sat in the shallows for an hour with it in my fist." His jaw moved. "I don't know what I thought I'd feel." The room was very quiet. "What did you feel?" Jon said. Robert looked at him. The floating quality in his eyes sharpened slightly, not all the way to sobriety, but enough. The blue eyes that were Robert Baratheon's most Baratheon feature, dark blue, the color of deep water, moved across Jon's face with an attention that was different from his usual attention. Slower, more careful. "Empty," Robert said. "I felt empty. I thought killing him would fill something. It didn't fill a bloody thing." He looked away. The whole war was supposed to fill something. He laughed once, a sound with no joy in it. 20 years on a throne and I'm still looking for the ruby. He closed his eyes. Jon sat at the foot of the bed and said nothing, and felt the specific and terrible grief of losing something he had never been given the chance to have. He had prepared himself to hate this man. He had carried that preparation carefully, like a weapon he hadn't needed to draw yet. Sitting here in the smell of the poultices and the poppy, he found that preparation entirely useless. Robert Baratheon had killed Rhaegar Targaryen in a river. Robert Baratheon was also a man dying badly in a bed, grieving a war he had won and found hollow, looking for rubies in a ford, because he didn't know what else to look for. Both of these things were true. Jon did not know what to do with the fact that both of these things were true. Ned's voice was very quiet. "Robert, the succession we need to speak about." "Joffrey," Robert said without opening his eyes. He said the name with no warmth and considerable effort, the name of a decision that had been made when the relevant feeling was absent. "Joffrey takes the throne. You'll be Lord Protector. You'll keep things." He paused. "You'll keep things as they should be, the way you always have." He opened his eyes and looked at Ned with an expression that was the oldest thing Jon had seen on him. Older than the war, older than the throne, something from before all of it. "I was better with you around, you know that." Ned's face did something complicated and controlled it immediately. "I know," he said. Robert's eyes moved one final time to Jon. They stayed there. The floating quality had returned, the poppy pulling him back, but underneath it something was working. some last effort of a mind that had spent 20 years sitting on a throne and had gotten better than people gave it credit for at looking at things it didn't want to see. "You have," Robert started. Jon held himself perfectly still. "Her eyes," Robert said, "Lyanna's eyes, that gray, that north in them." He blinked slowly. "Reminds me of better days. Don't let this city take them." He closed his own. Jon stood quietly and left the room. Ned found him at the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the city. They stood together without speaking for a moment. Below, King's Landing continued its 500,000 lives without interruption, indifferent to what was dying in the room above it. "She's already moving," Ned said. "Cersei, the gold cloaks are being reassigned. Janos Slynt is taking coin from the Lannisters. Varys confirmed it an hour ago. If Joffrey is named king and she has the gold cloaks, she controls the city." "And us," Jon said. "And us." Ned looked out at the lights. "We have a window, days perhaps. Less if she moves before Robert is cold." He turned to Jon. "I have been trying to find the right moment for 2 months, the right circumstances, the right allies, enough time to prepare. I have been wrong about how much time we have." Jon looked at him. Barris. The lineage evidence. He paused. "Howland Reed is at Greywater Watch. A raven could reach him. I've already sent it." Ned's jaw was tight. "Jon, what we're talking about, if we do this, if we take this step, there is no taking it back. Whatever comes after, it comes." "I know. You understand what comes after. Cersei doesn't yield ground." Jon turned from the window to face his father. "She'll fight. Whatever allies she has, whatever she's already planned, she'll use all of it. The Lannisters don't lose quietly." He paused. "Neither do we." In the torchlight of the corridor, Jon could see the 15 years of it on his father's face, the weight of the secret, the cost of carrying it, the thing it had done to his marriage and his honor and the interior of his life that no one outside him could see. It had made him older. It had made him something else, too, something harder at the core, like a tree that has grown around a wound. "Robert is dying," Ned said. "By morning or by the day after. When he goes, we have hours before Cersei consolidates the gold cloaks." "Then we don't wait for morning," Jon said. Ghost had followed them down the corridor and was sitting 3 feet back, watching them both with those red eyes that caught the torchlight and held it. He was perfectly still. He had been perfectly still since the King's Wood, since the blood in the undergrowth and the sound of the voices that carried the wrong register. Ned put his hand on the back of Jon's neck, the same grip as always, the same steady pressure of something solid in the world. He held it for a moment, then he released it. "Get some sleep," Ned said. "One of us should." Jon walked back to his chamber. He did not sleep. He sat at the window with Ghost at his feet and watched the city and thought about a ruby sitting in a man's fist in a river and what it felt like to hold something that didn't fill the space you were carrying. Below the window, King's Landing burned its torches against the dark and waited without knowing it was waiting for morning. Robert Baratheon died in the hour before the sun came up, which was either fitting or meaningless depending on who was counting. Ned was with him. Jon was not. Jon was in the corridor outside the Tower of the Hand with Ghost and 4 Stark men-at-arms, and a letter that Ned had written out twice, once in his own hand, once copied by the Maester, addressed to every lord of consequence in Westeros. The ravens had gone out an hour before Robert's last breath. The letter contained 2 things: the truth about Joffrey's parentage, documented with the lineage evidence Jon had assembled, and a second truth that the letter described in precise, careful legal language that left no room for the charge of madness or ambition. Jon had read both drafts. He had suggested 3 changes. Ned had made 2 of them when Ned emerged from the bedchamber. His face was the face of a man who had just lost his oldest friend and could not afford to grieve him yet. He looked at Jon. He nodded once. Jon pushed off the wall and they walked. Cersei was already there. This was not surprising. Varys had told Jon 3 days ago that the Queen's household had been receiving night visitors since Robert's wound was assessed as mortal. Men arriving at the servants' entrance after midnight, staying an hour, leaving before dawn. The gold-cloaked senior officers. Certain lords of the Crown lands whose loyalty was, it turned out, a commodity with a price already negotiated. She sat at the head of the council table. She had taken Robert's chair without theater, without ceremony, with the flat efficiency of someone occupying a space they had been preparing to occupy for years. Joffrey sat to her right, golden and irritable, dressed in clothes that had been cut for a king, while the king who wasn't dead yet finished dying. Pycelle was already seated, his old hands folded on the table, his rheumy eyes fixed on the door with the expression of a man who has already decided which direction the wind is blowing. Littlefinger occupied his customary chair with his customary ease, his mockingbird pin catching the early light, his eyes conducting their customary separate conversation from the rest of his face. Varys sat at the table's far end and said nothing, and watched everything. 12 Lannister guards stood along the walls. Jon counted them as he entered behind Ned, catalogued their positions, noted the 2 at the door and the 4 near the window and the 6 distributed around the table's perimeter. He noted that their hands were near their swords but not on them. A threat position to become a fact. Not yet a fact. His 4 Stark men came through the door behind him and stood. Cersei looked at Ned and then at Jon and then back at Ned. Something moved in her green eyes. Not surprise. Not quite. The thing she had been waiting for, perhaps. The thing she had been preparing for since a bastard secretary had sat in her pavilion and answered her questions without giving her anything to hold. "Lord Stark," she said. "You're late. Robert is dead," Ned said. "Yes." She let the words sit for exactly the time it needed and no longer, "which means my son is king. Which means this council convenes to confirm the succession and secure the capital." She looked around the table. "I'll have your oaths, each of you in turn beginning with the Grand Maester." Cersei looked at him. "Before any oath is sworn to anyone," Ned said, "there is a matter this council has the right to hear, a matter of succession, a matter of law." He did not sit. He remained standing at the table's edge, with his hands at his sides and the same quality of immovability that Jon had been watching him carry for 20 years. The quality of a man who has located the correct position and has no intention of being moved from it by force or argument or social pressure or anything short of death. "I invoke the council's right to hear evidence before it acts." Cersei's jaw was very still. Evidence of what? Of who has the superior claim to the Iron Throne? The room breathed in. "Joffrey Baratheon," Cersei said, each word placed precisely, "is Robert's firstborn son, and the rightful—" "Joffrey Baratheon," Ned said, "is not Robert's son." Pycelle made a sound. Littlefinger's hand moved slightly on the table and stopped. Joffrey's face did something complicated and young, the face of a boy who has been told something about himself that he doesn't yet have the framework to process. Cersei did not move at all. She sat in Robert's chair with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on Ned, and her stillness was the most dangerous thing in the room. Barristan Selmy stood at his post beside the door. His hand had gone to his sword hilt, not drawing, not threatening, the reflex of a man whose body had been a weapon for 50 years responding to a sudden sharpness in the air. His pale eyes were on Ned. His face was the face of a knight who has just heard a charge leveled in front of him and does not yet know which side of it he is standing on. Ned spoke. He spoke for 4 minutes, which was exactly how long it took to say the essential things without embellishment. The Tower of Joy. 3 Kingsguard who had no reason to guard a bastard. Lyanna's death. The promise. The child. He set the lineage documentation on the table, Jon's work clean and thorough, 3 pages, and he set beside it a letter from Howland Reed that had arrived by Raven 2 days ago, sealed with the Reed and Lizard Lion sigil of Greywater Watch, the Lord of the Neck confirming in his own hand that he had stood in the Tower of Joy, that he had seen what was inside it, that he had watched Eddard Stark carry a living child out of that place. Ned set both documents on the table and stepped back. "The child," Ned said, "is here." Every eye in the room moved to Jon. Jon had been standing 3 feet behind Ned's left shoulder, where a secretary stood, where the background stood, where the person everyone had been looking past for 8 chapters stood. He did not step forward dramatically. He did not announce himself. He simply stopped being the background and let them look at him, which was a different thing and more powerful. Barristan's pale eyes moved across Jon's face. Jon watched him do it. Watched the old knight's gaze move from the jaw to the eyes, to the set of the shoulders, to the particular quality of stillness. The stillness they had discussed in the training yard, the stillness Barristan had recognized as a philosophy rather than a habit. He watched Barristan arrive somewhere. He watched the arrival register in the old knight's face as a physical event, a slight parting of the lips, a very small tightening around the eyes, the expression of a man who has just heard a note he has been waiting to hear for 15 years without knowing he was waiting. "His name," Ned said quietly, "is Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name. legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. He was born at the Tower of Joy. He has been in my household since before he could walk." Barristan's hand came off his sword hilt. Cersei's voice cut through everything like cold iron. "Arrest them." The Lannister guards moved. Ned's 4 men moved to meet them, and the room became noise and the scrape of steel, and Littlefinger's chair pushing back and Pycelle making a sound that was either prayer or protest, and Joffrey standing with his hand on Lion's Tooth and his face showing. Finally, the cruelty underneath the confusion. Jon did not move. He stood in his place and let it happen around him for exactly the 3 seconds it took to understand that no one was going to die in the next moment. The Lannister guards were not committing, they were positioning. They were waiting for a signal that Cersei was calculating whether to give. And then he spoke. Enough. It was not loud. He did not project it or harden it or put any particular authority into the volume. He said it the way you say something true, flatly, without decoration, in the tone of a man stating a fact about the weather. The room went quiet. Jon looked at Cersei. "The evidence has been presented," he said. "The Grand Maester has read it. Lord Varys has read it. Sir Barristan has heard it." He paused. "You can have your guards arrest Lord Stark. You can have them arrest me. You can dismiss everything on this table as fabrication and conspiracy and call for our heads in the morning." His voice was steady and completely without heat. "Or you can understand that every lord in Westeros received a raven 3 hours ago, and that the next move you make will be the one the realm judges you by." Cersei stared at him. "You planned this," she said. "Lord Stark planned it," Jon said. "I simply agreed with him about the timing." Jaime Lannister appeared in the doorway. He had arrived from somewhere, the corridor, the outer chamber. Jon had not seen him enter. He stood with his white cloak in his sword hand and his green eyes moving from Cersei to Jon to Ned to the guards positioned in the room, reading the geometry of it with the instant tactical intelligence of a man who had been doing this kind of reading his whole life. His eyes landed on Barristan. Barristan had not moved from his post since his hand had come off his sword hilt. He stood in the white cloak of the Kingsguard with his pale eyes fixed on Jon and his face carrying something that had not fully resolved yet, grief or recognition, or the specific weight of a man who has just discovered that the thing he spent his life looking for was here the whole time, wearing a bastard's name. Barristan looked at him. He looked at his sworn brother, his fellow knight, the man who had shared the white cloak with him for years, and something moved through his face that settled, slowly and completely, into certainty. "I have sworn to protect the rightful king," Barristan said. His voice was very quiet and entirely without doubt. "For 30 years I have been trying to find one." He crossed the room and stood beside Jon. Cersei's face did not change. This was more frightening than if it had. She looked at Barristan for a long moment, then at Jaime, then at the guards, then at the documents on the table, and she performed. In the space of those few seconds, the same calculation Jon had watched her perform in the pavilion on the road, that particular assessment of a chess position where several moves have been revealed as unavailable simultaneously. She was not beaten. Jon knew this. She was reconfiguring. There was a difference. "This council," Littlefinger said from his chair, with the careful pleasantness of a man who has been watching an auction and has just decided which item he's bidding on, "may wish to consider a recess. No delay. No private conversations in corridors. Everything that happens next happens in this room where everyone can see it." He looked at the Lannister guards. "Stand down." They looked at Cersei. She did not signal them, which was itself a signal. They stepped back. Jon looked at the documents on the table, at the faces around it, at the man sitting in a child's body beside his mother, the golden boy who had tried to back Arya into a corner on a riverbank and been walked back by a bastard secretary with immaculate courtesy, who was now sitting in a chair at the small council table while the foundations of his entire existence were being publicly examined and found unstable. He felt something for Joffrey, not sympathy, not quite, the recognition of what it cost to learn that the story you'd been told about yourself was not the true story. That was not Joffrey's fault. What came after, what Joffrey did with it, that would be. "We'll need to establish a regency," Varys said smoothly, from the table's far end, as though this were a procedural matter and the last 4 minutes had been perfectly ordinary, pending resolution of the succession question. "Lord Stark holds Robert's letter of regency. That is the legal instrument in force until the council rules otherwise." He looked around the table. "I believe we have sufficient evidence to begin that ruling today, or we can wait for the ravens to return from the Lords of the Realm." He tilted his head, though I suspect we'll find the lords of the realm have opinions. The chamber held everything it had been handed, the documents, the testimony, the choice of a man in a white cloak, the silence of a queen who was recalculating. And waited. Jon stood in it and did not reach for anything. He was not ready to want what this room was pointing at. He was not sure he would ever be ready. But he was here, and the truth was on the table, and Barristan Selmy was standing beside him with 50 years of looking for a worthy king behind him. And outside the window, King's Landing was waking up and did not yet know that the name it had been given for its king was wrong. Morning came into the room through the east-facing window. Jon stood in it and let it come. The north is cold and full of whispers. The Patreon link is in the description. The full Logic Bible, exclusive timelines, and members-only deep dives. Now, the ravens are coming back. The city did not know yet. It knew something. Cities always knew something. The specific animal awareness of 500,000 people sharing air and water, and the vibrations that moved through stone when powerful things happened inside stone buildings. The street vendors and the dock workers and the alehouses and the brothels knew that something had changed in the Red Keep, the way a dog knows a storm before the clouds arrive. But they did not know what. The official silence was holding, which meant they had perhaps a day before the silence became noise. Jon stood at the window of the room he had been given the previous night, not the secretary's closet 2 floors down, a proper room on the same level as Ned's solar, with a window that faced east and caught the full violence of the sunrise over the bay. He had not slept. Ghost was on the floor behind him, finally, genuinely still, not the coiled alertness of the past weeks but something that had released, an animal that had been tracking something and had found it and could now rest. He was breathing slowly, his white sides moving in the dawn light, his red eyes closed. Jon watched the city wake. Somewhere in that city, Janos Slynt was under arrest. Ned had moved on the gold cloaks before midnight, with a signed instrument from the council, 3 signatures, which was enough to constitute a quorum, which Varys had pointed out with quiet satisfaction, replacing Slynt with a man whose loyalty had been carefully established over the preceding weeks. Some of Slynt's senior officers had accepted this. 2 had not. Those 2 were in the same dungeon as Slynt, which was the cleanest possible resolution of their disagreement. Cersei was in her chambers. She was not under arrest. Ned had argued against this not from mercy but from calculation. Arresting the queen without the realm's lords present to witness it would look like exactly the kind of power seizure it wasn't. Let her move. Watch what she reaches for. You learn more from what a cornered person grabs than from anything else about them. Jon had not argued with this. He had listened and considered and concluded that Ned was right, and had said so and had felt the strange new quality of being listened to in return, not as a secretary, not as a bastard nephew, but as someone whose assessment of a problem carried weight. He was still working out what to do with that. Barristan came before the household was properly awake. He knocked once and entered at Jon's word, and stood in the center of the room with his white cloak and his pale eyes, and the specific quality of a man who has made an irrevocable decision overnight and has arrived at the other side of it intact. He looked older in the morning light than he had in the training yard. He also looked cleaner somehow, as though the decision had stripped something away. "I want to tell you something about your father," Barristan said, "before the day begins. Before it gets too loud to say things quietly." Jon turned from the window. He was afraid of what he was, Barristan said. Not of being a prince, not of being a warrior, of what the prophecy meant, the weight of it, what it required of him. He read everything written about the long night, about Azor Ahai, about the prince that was promised, and he came to believe that whatever was coming, whatever the cold brought with it, required a sacrifice he hadn't been asked to consent to. Barristan paused. He was trying to prevent something. With your mother. The child he was trying to produce. He believed the blood of dragon and wolf together would be the answer to whatever was coming. He went about it in the worst possible way. He broke his marriage, started a war, got himself killed. The old knight's mouth pressed flat. But he was not a monster. He was a man trying to solve an impossible problem and failing publicly. Jon was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me this now because you think I should know why he made the choices he made. I'm telling you because you're going to stand in front of men who will define him as a villain, and you should know that the truth was more complicated." Barristan looked at him steadily. "And because you have his melancholy, that same quality of carrying something you can't put down." He wore it differently, Rhaegar was silver and still where you are dark and watchful, but the weight is the same. I recognized it in the training yard and couldn't name it. I can name it now. Is that a warning? It's an observation. The weight is real. Carrying it alone is what broke him. Barristan moved to the door. You have people around you. Use them. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Your stillness is better than his was. In the end, he let the prophecy make him restless. You are very still. He left. Jon stood in the room with the sunrise and Ghost's slow breathing and the weight that Barristan had named, and let it settle where it settled. The ravens were returning. Not all of them. Lords in the Reach and Dorne and the far Westerlands were still days away from receiving the message, let alone days away from responding. But the Crown Lands lords had received their ravens within hours and had responded with the speed of men who understood that being first carried value. 7 letters of conditional support, 3 of cautious silence, 1 from a minor lord in the Crown Lands that was technically treason and was filed accordingly. From the north, nothing yet. Too far. Too early. Jon sorted the letters with Varys at a table in the maester's room, while Ned read correspondence from his own chain of informants and made notes in his careful hand. This was what governance looked like, Jon was discovering. Not speeches, not confrontations, but tables covered in paper and men reading very carefully. Tywin Lannister received the raven yesterday evening, Varys said. He was turning a letter over in his hands without opening it, which seemed to be something he did with other people's correspondence as a matter of habit. He will not respond by raven. He will send a man. The man will arrive in 4 days and will deliver terms. What terms, Ned said without looking up. Jaime's freedom. Cersei's freedom. Joffrey's life and comfortable exile. In exchange for Lannister acknowledgement of Jon's claim and the debt forgiveness, Varys set the letter down. He'll frame it as pragmatism. Tywin Lannister has never in his life framed anything as concession. And if we refuse, Jon said, then 60,000 Westermen begin moving east from Casterly Rock in approximately 2 weeks. Varys looked at Jon with those careful, busy eyes. The question is whether they arrive to find King's Landing already resolved or still contested. A resolved capital with a legitimate king and Stannis Baratheon's fleet in the harbor is a very different military proposition than a city still burning with succession dispute. Stannis, Ned said, has received the documentation. Sir Barristan's sworn testimony was sent by ship from King's Landing Harbor this morning. A fast galley, 6 hours across the bay to Dragonstone. Varys's mouth moved slightly. I am told Stannis read it 3 times. He has not yet responded, which for Stannis Baratheon is the most interesting possible response. The raven from Winterfell arrived at the 3rd hour after midday. It was not from Robb. It was from Maester Luwin. Brief, formal, the precise handwriting of a man who chose words the way surgeons chose instruments. It confirmed the raven had arrived. It confirmed Lord Robb had read it. It confirmed that the northern lords were being summoned. Jon read it twice and set it down and felt the distance of 1,000 miles as a physical weight in his chest. The second raven arrived an hour later. This one was from Robb. The paper had been folded 3 times and the seal was Robb's personal seal. The direwolf pressed in gray wax, which Robb had started using when Jon left Winterfell the day of the royal progress 2 months ago, a lifetime ago. Jon broke it. He read the letter standing at his window with the afternoon light coming in and Ghost awake now, watching him. Jon, I have read what Father sent. I have read it 4 times. I am writing this before I call the lords because I need to say this to you before it becomes something said in front of a room full of people who will want to make it mean something political. You are my brother, whatever else you are. Whatever name you were born with and whatever throne that name points at, you are the person who taught Arya her first sword grip and sat with me through the fever I had at 13 and told me the truth when everyone else was telling me what I wanted to hear. That doesn't change because your father was someone other than who we thought. I am coming south, not for a king. For you, the lords are coming because I am calling them. What you do with that is your business. But I am coming because you are my brother, and you are in a city full of people who want you dead, and I would like to stand between you and them if you'll let me. Don't tell me not to come. I will not listen. Robb. Jon read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it inside his shirt, against his chest, where it would stay for the foreseeable future. Ghost put his head against Jon's leg. Jon put his hand on the direwolf's neck and stood there at the window for a while. Sansa found him. She had Lady with her. the direwolf padding beside her, with her head level and her amber eyes moving through the corridor with the calm assessment of an animal that had survived King's Landing by being very still and very watchful. Sansa herself was wearing a northern dress, something she had not done since leaving Winterfell. Gray wool, practical, a deliberate choice in a city where clothing was always a choice about something else. "I wanted to see if you were real," Sansa said. She said it plainly, without embarrassment. She had learned something in the past weeks, Jon thought. Some of the performance had worn off her, the layer of southern courtesy she had been applying over herself like a coat of paint. What was underneath was sharper and considerably more useful. "Everyone in the Red Keep is talking about you. The Aegon Targaryen version of you. And I wanted to see if that person was still you." "Is he?" Jon said. Sansa looked at him with those blue Tully eyes that were her mother's eyes. "Yes," she said. "Unfortunately for everyone who'd prefer a story they can use." She paused. "Joffrey has been very quiet since yesterday. That frightens me more than when he's loud." "I know, we're watching him. His mother is writing letters." Sansa looked at the closed door of the Queen's chambers. "A lot of them. I can hear the seals being broken and resealed, all night." She turned back to Jon. "She's not finished." "No," Jon said. "She isn't." Lady had come to Ghost, and the two direwolves were conducting a brief business-like exchange of information through the medium of scent and proximity. Then Lady sat. Ghost sat beside her. "I want to go home," Sansa said. The words came out smaller than everything else she'd said. "Not because I'm frightened, because this city—" She stopped. "I understand it better now than I did. I understand exactly why I don't want to understand it. When it's safe to move you," Jon said, "I'll get you and Arya out." Arya's been trying to get herself out for 3 weeks, something that was almost a smile. She's been asking Syrio Forel to help her map the lower exits. "I know," Jon said. "Syrio told me." Then it settled back into the careful composure of a girl who had been learning, without being taught, how to be the person a situation required. She took Lady and walked back toward her rooms. Jaime was waiting in the corridor when Jon returned, not blocking the way, standing to the side of it in the particular stance of a man who has decided to have a conversation and has arranged himself to make it appear casual. He had abandoned his white cloak. For the first time since Jon had been in King's Landing, Jaime Lannister was not wearing the Kingsguard's cloak, and was dressed in plain riding clothes, which was itself a statement about something Jon had not yet fully parsed. "You're still alive," Jaime said. "So are you," Jon said. "My sister thinks I should fix that." He said it pleasantly, the way he said most things, with the easy surface that made everything underneath it harder to read. "She sent me a letter last night, very specific suggestions." "What did you write back?" Jaime looked at him for a moment. The green eyes did their work. The 3-second assessment, the 4th second that was something else, something that had been developing since Winterfell's training yard when a bastard secretary had not flinched under examination. "Nothing yet," he said. "I'm still deciding." "What is there to decide?" Jaime was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the wall, at his own hands, at some middle distance that the corridor didn't actually contain. "I killed a king," he said. "A Targaryen king. Everyone in Westeros knows this, and most of them have opinions about it. What very few of them know is that I killed him because he was about to burn the city with wildfire. 500,000 people." He paused. He was going to burn them all and laugh while he did it. "So I put my sword through his back and sat on his throne and waited for Ned Stark to arrive and call me a traitor." He looked at Jon. "You are not him." "No," Jon said. "I'm not." "No." Jaime pushed off the wall. "That's the thing I keep arriving at." He walked past Jon toward the stair. He stopped without turning. "The letter to my sister is going to be difficult to write," he said. "I expect I'll spend a few more days on it." He descended the stairs. Jon stood in the corridor and understood that Jaime Lannister had just told him, in the only language the Kingslayer apparently had available, that he was not going to be the weapon his sister needed him to be. The raven from Dragonstone arrived at the 9th hour. 3 sentences in a hand so precise it looked machined. Jon read them standing in torchlight with Ned at his shoulder. "The evidence is sufficient. I will arrive in 7 days. I have questions that require answers in person, not by letter." Stannis Baratheon. Ned set the letter on the table. 7 days. "Robb is 3 weeks out," Jon said. "Maybe less." If he pushed when he left Winterfell, and he pushed. He looked out at the lights of King's Landing, the city that was still not fully aware of what was moving toward it. Robb's army from the north, Stannis' fleet from the east, Tywin's terms from the west, all of it converging on this hill above the Blackwater with its 500,000 lives and its ancient red castle and its throne made of swords. We need to hold the city for 7 days. We can hold the city, Ned said. The gold cloaks are secured. Varys has the lower gates. Barristan controls the keep. He was quiet for a moment. The harder thing is what comes after 7 days. The harder conversation, the room full of people who all had claims, all had armies, all had needs, and one of them was going to look at Jon Snow. Aegon Targaryen, the name still strange in his own mind, a coat he was still learning the fit of, and expect a king. Ghost stood and came to the window and put his nose against Jon's hand. Jon looked out at the city, the torches against the dark, the ships in the harbor, somewhere past the harbor, 7 days away, a fleet carrying a man who had spent his entire life being told he was the rightful heir and had just been handed documentation explaining he was not. He thought about what Varys had said in the Skull Cellar, about a hidden king who doesn't want to be king. He thought about Robb's letter inside his shirt, the paper warm now from his body heat. You are my brother, whatever else you are, whatever else. Jon held the shape of that for a moment. Then he turned from the window and sat at the table and began to read the next day's correspondence. Stannis Baratheon's fleet came out of the morning fog like a fact. 30 ships, no banners flying. He had not raised the crowned stag of his house, which was itself a statement about what he considered himself to be arriving as. Not a claimant, not an invader. A man who had received documentation and required answers that paper could not provide. Jon stood at the harbor wall and watched the flagship anchor. A single longboat came ashore. 6 men, Sir Davos Seaworth at the prow, the Onion Knight the smuggler made lord, a man whose face carried the permanent expression of someone who had survived more improbable situations than anyone around him realized, and Stannis himself at the center of the boat, sitting with his hands on his knees and his jaw set in the particular configuration that his face apparently defaulted to when he was thinking very hard and had no interest in anyone knowing it. Stannis stepped onto the dock. He looked at Jon for a long moment before he looked at anything else. Then he said, "You're shorter than I expected." Jon said, "You're exactly as I expected." Something moved in Stannis's face that might, in a different man, have been the precursor to a smile. He walked past Jon toward the inn at the harbor's edge that had been cleared and prepared for this meeting, and Jon followed, and Ghost followed Jon, and Davos Seaworth fell into step beside the direwolf with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who had sailed across a bay for stranger things than this. They sat across a table. No advisors, no witnesses. Stannis had insisted. Jon had agreed, which had made Varys make a face that he had immediately smoothed away. The room had a window overlooking the bay and a table with 2 cups of water on it that neither of them touched. Stannis looked at him the way he looked at ledgers, completely, without sentiment, with the specific attention of a man who found inaccuracy offensive on a moral level. The documentation is sufficient, he said. Barristan Selmy's testimony is credible. Howland Reed's letter is credible. The lineage argument is clean. He paused. Your claim is superior to mine. I have understood this since I read the Tower of Joy document. It took me approximately 4 minutes to reach that conclusion, and I have spent the 6 days since testing it for flaws. Did you find any? Jon said. No. The word came out flat and final, and carrying the specific weight of a man admitting something that has cost him considerably. My claim runs through my grandmother Rhael Targaryen. It was always secondary to the dynasty itself. A legitimate Targaryen heir alive makes my claim functionally worthless from a legal standpoint. Stannis looked at the table. I have spent my entire life insisting that what is legal and what is right are the same thing. This is the first time that principle has removed something from me rather than given me it. I know, Jon said. You don't, Stannis said. Not harshly, just accurately. You were raised as nothing. You have spent your life with less than you were owed. I was raised as a lord's son and a king's brother, and I have spent my life watching things I earned be given to people who did not earn them. He looked up. This is different. I understand that. But you asked if I found flaws in your claim, and the honest answer requires me to tell you that I looked for them with considerable motivation. Jon looked at him across the table, the most legally rigorous man in Westeros, who had sent ravens to every lord in Westeros declaring Joffrey a bastard before Jon had even arrived in King's Landing. A man who had been right about nearly everything his whole life and received almost nothing for it. I need a general, Jon said. Not a servant, not a subordinate, a a general with authority over the realm's military response to what's coming from the north. He paused. You are the finest military commander in Westeros. I have no experience commanding armies. What I have is acclaim, and advisors, and people who will stand with me. What I don't have is what you've spent 30 years developing. He held Stannis' gaze. I'm offering you the chance to serve the realm the way you've always wanted to, without having to be the king everyone hates. The room was quiet. Stannis looked at him for a long time. Something worked in his jaw. Not emotion, but the specific motion of a man running calculations he had not anticipated needing to run. You're offering me a position, he said. In your court. I'm offering you the position that fits what you actually are, Jon said. The realm doesn't need you on the throne. It needs you in the field. Stannis looked out the window at his fleet sitting in the bay. He was quiet for long enough that the quiet became its own kind of answer. Then he said, What comes from the north? The White Walkers, Jon said. The long night, Ghost has felt them in his runs, in the wind beyond the wall, in the particular quality of cold that has a direction. I have felt it in ways I cannot fully explain, and I do not say things I cannot explain to rooms full of people I need to trust me. He watched Stannis' face absorb this. The war we're fighting right now is for a chair. The war that's coming is for everything else. Stannis said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll need full authority over military logistics, supply chains, troop movements, fortification decisions, no interference from council members who've never held a sword. Agreed, and I'll want it in writing. Signed, sealed, witnessed. Today, Jon said, If you'll have it. He did not offer his hand. He was not, evidently, a man who concluded things with gestures. I'll have it, he said. And then, because he was Stannis Baratheon and honesty was the only language he had ever trusted, You're not what I expected. You said that about my height. I meant it about everything else. He walked to the door. He stopped. Your father played the harp, he said. I always thought that was foolish. For a warrior, I understand it better now. He left. Jon sat alone in the room with the 2 untouched cups of water and Ghost's chin on his knee, and felt something that had been drawn tight for 10 chapters release, one careful degree at a time. Tywin Lannister's envoy, a thin man named Lyman, with careful eyes and the practiced neutrality of someone paid to deliver difficult things, presented the terms in the Tower of the Hand at midday: Cersei's freedom, Jaime's freedom, the children's lives, the debt forgiven. Lannister acknowledgement of Jon's claim in exchange for it all. Jon read the terms. He looked at Ned. He looked at Varys. He said, Tell Lord Tywin his children's lives are not in question and never were. Tell him we'll discuss the rest when his daughter stops writing letters to the gold cloaks she no longer controls. Cersei's last move came 2 hours later, a public announcement through Joffrey's herald that the king would graciously submit his claim to formal review by the assembled lords of the realm. Theater. A delay tactic, an attempt to buy the 3 weeks until Tywin could position forces. Jon accepted publicly, immediately, in writing naming Barristan Selmy and Stannis Baratheon as his witnesses, and inviting every lord currently in King's Landing to attend. Cersei could not withdraw the offer without confirming she had known it would fail. The Great Hall was summoned for the 1st hour after sunset. Robb's riders arrived at the 4th hour after midday, hard-ridden, their horses lathered and their cloaks still showing the dust of the King's Road. 6 men, riding ahead of the northern host by 2 days at a full gallop, carrying Robb Stark's personal seal and a message that Jon read in the corridor outside the Great Hall with 10 minutes to spare, were coming. Hold whatever you need to hold. R. Jon folded the letter, tucked it next to the first one, inside his shirt, against his chest. He walked into the Great Hall. They had all come. The assembled lords of the Crownlands and what remained of the court, 30 men and their households, which was not the realm but was a beginning. Ned stood to the right of the dais, his face carrying the composed stillness he carried into all important rooms, the face of a man who has made his choices and is standing by them. Barristan stood at the foot of the steps in his white cloak with his hand on his sword hilt, not threatening, present, the statement of a body that had made a decision. Stannis stood to the left of the dais, with Davos beside him and his fleet in the harbor, and 30 years of waiting on his face. Cersei sat with Joffrey at the far end of the room. She was watching. She was always watching, but she was also counting, and what she was counting had been arriving at the same conclusion for 3 days, that the floor had gone from under her in increments so small she had not felt any single one of them, and the total was irrecoverable. Littlefinger stood against the wall with his mockingbird pin and his calculating eyes, watching everything and committing to nothing, which was his natural condition and was today indistinguishable from irrelevance. Varys stood near the door, soft and bald, and entirely satisfied in the way of a man watching something he planned arrive. Ghost walked at Jon's heel as Jon crossed the hall floor. The direwolf's paws made no sound. The assembled lords tracked him, the white wolf, the red eyes, the animal that had been a bastard secretary's shadow for 2 months and was now something else. The weight of it visible in every step. Jon climbed the dais steps. He turned. The Iron Throne was directly behind him. He could feel it without looking. The heat it gave off, the particular atmosphere of a thing that had absorbed 3 centuries of use and decision and blood. He did not sit in it. He stood on the dais in front of it and faced the room, and the room went quiet to hear him, because his voice was not loud and they understood, instinctively, that this was a man who said what he meant and would not repeat it. "I'm going to tell you something that's not about a throne," he said. The hall listened. "There is a cold coming that has nothing to do with winter." He watched them. Some of the lords shifted. He did not accommodate the shift. Not weather, not season, something older. Something the wall was built to hold back 8,000 years ago. Something that is not, whatever your maester has told you, gone from the world. He paused. "My wolf knows. He has felt it in his runs, in the wind beyond the wall, in the particular quality of cold that has a direction. I have felt it in ways I cannot fully explain, and I do not say things I cannot explain to rooms full of people I need to trust me." He held the room. "The Night's Watch has been sending ravens that the crown has not answered. Ned Stark's ranger returned from beyond the wall wrong and has been wrong for 14 years. What is coming is real, and it will not care about this argument, this hall, this chair, or any of us if we spend the time it is giving us fighting each other over who sits in it." The silence was complete. "I will not sit in that chair," Jon said, "until I know that what waits beyond the wall is not already marching. Every king who sat in it died, some in battle, some in bed, most of them not well, and none of them for the right reason. I don't intend to sit in it at all unless what comes from the north is first defeated." He looked across the assembled faces, the lords, the uncertain, the calculating, the moved. He found Ned's face. He found Stannis's face. He found Robb's riders standing at the back of the hall with road dust still on their shoulders. "That is my pledge to you. Not a crown, a direction. North, where the real enemy waits. And when that enemy is faced and answered, then we can argue about the chair." He stopped speaking. The hall absorbed it. Some of the lords were confused. They had come for a coronation and received a military briefing delivered with the certainty of something personal. Some were moved, in the particular way of people who have spent their lives waiting to hear someone say something plainly true and had stopped believing it would come. Stannis Baratheon stood to Jon's left, with his jaw working slightly and his eyes on the middle distance, thinking through the logistics of what he had just been handed. Ned Stark stood to the right of the dais, with his hands at his sides and his gray eyes closed, briefly, in the expression of a man who has been carrying something for 15 years and has just set it down in the right place. Relief, grief, something else underneath both of them, the quiet, specific thing that Lyanna Stark had asked him to protect, standing on a dais in the city that had taken everything from her, refusing to be consumed by it. Ghost sat at the foot of the dais steps and looked out at the assembled room with his red eyes and his white face, and was absolutely still. Cersei was watching Jon from the far end of the hall. Her face was controlled and cold and carried the last of something that had once been power. She was not defeated. She was Cersei Lannister, and she would never be entirely defeated while she was breathing. But she was contained, and she knew it. And she looked at Jon Snow standing on the dais with the Iron Throne behind him and the North coming for him and Stannis' fleet in the harbor, and the greatest living knight in the realm at his side, and for the first time in Jon's presence her expression was not calculating. It was something closer to recognition. He was not what she had been fighting. She understood that now. What she had been fighting was this: not ambition, not hunger, not the ordinary grasping that she knew how to defeat because she had built her life inside it. She had been fighting a man who genuinely believed the throne was not the point. She had no strategy for that. Jon held the room for another moment. Then he turned and looked at the Iron Throne. The 1,000 swords melted together by Balerion's fire, the seed of a dynasty that had ended, and that he was perhaps someday going to attempt to restart, and he did not touch it. He descended the dais steps. Ghost rose and fell into step beside him. and the hall, very slowly, began to breathe again. The snow began falling in the hour that King's Landing was settling into the particular quiet of something unresolved becoming, at last, resolved. It fell without wind, straight down, in the darkness beyond the wall, where the old trees grew in shapes that suggested they were remembering something and had been remembering it for a very long time. The cold deepened the way cold deepens when it has intention behind it. Not weather, not season, but something that had been waiting in the dark since before the wall was built, and would go on waiting until it chose not to. It fell, and the darkness looked south, and waited. The north is cold and full of whispers, and now the north remembers. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.